Rita Dove. And title, well, Professor of English, I guess. You know, when I read, this sounds really weird, but when I was about 10 or 11, I stumbled across the Iliad at home. My father had bought the great books of the Western world, and one of the first books there was the Iliad. I had no idea what it was, but it was a very long thing, and I thought, this is the beginning of literature, so I'm going to read this. And I understood probably about half of it, but it was fascinating. It was an incredibly tense and interesting story. And once I got into the whole way that the poems worked, it read like a swashbuckling mystery in a way. So that made me feel like, gosh, this is exciting. I'd like to do that too. The one that I remember, I wrote poems before this, but the one that I consider the first real poem was about that time too, but it was an Easter poem. It's in school we were supposed to write or paint or do something artistic for Easter. So I wrote this poem called The Rabbit with the Droopy Ear, and I remember it because when I began writing the poem, I had no idea how it was going to end. I just had this idea of a rabbit, the Easter bunny, who had one ear that, drooped down, and he was distressed. So I kept writing, and it rhymed and all that. And it was actually the rhyme itself that helped me solve the problem of the rabbit with the droopy ear. So at the end of the poem, it goes, hip, hip, hooray, let's toast him a cup, for now both ears were hanging up. He hangs himself from a tree, and his ears hang straight, and everybody's cheering. And I was just, I don't know, it was very exciting to find that ending. I actually had to read it aloud in class. That was another thing. Gosh, those were the days when you did these things in class. But no, people showed their paintings if they had something for Easter, and I had to read my poem aloud. And people liked it. The kids liked it, my friends. So that was an instant success story. It hasn't totally changed. It's changed in the sense that and to some extent, I know, let's say that the goal is not to come to some kind of neat solution, as that did. But it hasn't changed in the sense that at some level, I'm never quite sure how the poem is going to resolve itself, and that I'm always in some way surprised. I make a discovery in a poem as I write it. By now, that means more accessing the subconscious, and the fact that if I begin writing a poem, that means I'm intrigued in some way by whatever it's about, and that if I'm not trying to find something new and pushing that envelope in the poem, I can't expect my reader to be particularly excited about it either. It's different every time. And in fact, years ago, there was I did do something like that for a magazine where a journalist actually followed me around, and we tried to, but it's slightly different every time. My inspiration comes from everywhere. Just walking down the street, and I never know where it's going to come from. So I keep a notebook with me at all times, and the only criteria for anything making it into that notebook is if it stops me in my tracks for even an instant, if it catches my eye or my ear, and I just write it down. That means there are recipes in there, there are words, and sometimes there's a character description, or sometimes it's a line. And after that point, though, what happens is kind of odd. I work in fragments. In the sense that I'm not going to sit down and say, first line is this, and now I'm going to just write my way through it. I let the poem, it's like piecing it together like a pot. So I might have a line that I might write down on the middle of a page, and I still write things down with a pen on paper. I go to the computer when it gets too messy and use it like an elaborate typewriter, because I print it out and then I mess it up again. But when I do sit down to write in my room, in my study, and I try to write at a certain time every night. I'm a night person. My best times are midnight to 6, actually. I'll leaf through my notebooks, and if something catches my eye and I feel like I want to transfer it from the notebook to the page, I do. And then comes this very strange process, which is difficult to describe, in that I'll write until I get stuck, or I can't go any further, or I'm boring myself, or whatever. And then I might go to another poem. I might go to another folder where there are other drafts of poems in various stages of completion. And the only way I have for keeping track of all this fragmentary stuff is by color. And I have different colored folders, red folders, blue, yellow. So I might go into my study, let's say one evening, and say, I feel like the blue folder today. And I'll pick up the blue folder and see what's in there. So it's something that I've kind of worked at over the years, but the colors are only because I didn't want to put anything, I didn't want to file anything in a straight, you know, I think if you put something in a file that says war poems or love poems, that you already restrict the way in which the poem might move. If I put it in blue, it could be sad blue, it could be happy blue, it could be peaceful blue, but my mood at the moment when I'm about to work on that poem will tell me where I want to go. So it's an odd process, but I do lots of revisions, and I love to revise. So 30, 40 revisions is not unusual. At this stage, I do most of my revisions by myself until I reach a point where I either need to give it lots of time, because time is a great reviser too, you know, just months of putting it aside. Or I will show it, a lot of times I'll show it to my husband, who is a novelist. And as a prose writer, he has a totally different take on things. So he comes at it a different way. I yearn for those old days, you know, from graduate school where you go into a workshop and people would give you all these ideas and you take it away from you. But at this point, that just doesn't, it's not in the cards, so. I think it's both. I think that you certainly don't have to be aged and you know and travel the world to write a poem. In fact, sometimes traveling the world is a way of not writing a poem. But it's the quality of experience. It's being able to experience something, and when you begin to write about it, be able to apply the tools that you need for writing, you know, a mastery of the language and a way of piecing together the language, I guess. That those two factors have to come together. So you do need to work at it, but you also have to be able to know when to take the experience as it happened, when to tweak it a little bit, what part of the experience is going to move somebody else, and what part is really your own private moment. So I've seen poems written by very young people which are absolutely stunning, and of course we have examples of Baudelaire, and you know, wrote when he was in his teens. These are amazing poems, so he obviously didn't have a wealth of experience or age or anything like that. And I've seen poems which, of course, could only have been written by someone who was older and had lived certain, you know, stages of life, have gone through certain stages of life. But it's a combination of the two. It really is. You know, I've always felt that the poems I've written which have historical context are hopefully not just simply plucking something out of history and saying, ooh, great, let's write about that. In every case, what has happened is that I've become fascinated or haunted by something and couldn't shake it. As an African American, as a woman, I think that I've been sensitized to the way in which history privileges the white male and the way in which certain aspects of history, the things that we are taught in school, the things that are handed down, never never enter the picture, though they might have been very important. Anyone can tell you that, at the risk of oversimplification, let me say that anyone can tell you that how you're raised as a child has a great deal to do with how you behave as an adult. And whether you have complexes or whether you need to prove yourself or all that kind of stuff. And yet, the mother in a traditional family who has raised a child never makes it in the history books. I mean, and so those kinds of things have always irritated me. Let's put it that way. And I'm always reminded when I see someone, Napoleon stalks through the battlefields, and I think, yeah, but how did he get that way? How did this guy become who he was? So that's the predisposition I had, I think, as a writer, as a person who wanted to create poetry. It's one of the things that has always been one of my the things I carry along with me. Each time it's different. For instance, in this new book, which is tells the story of a black, a mixed race violinist, George Bridgetower, who grew up in 18th and 19th century Europe. I came upon him because I was watching a movie, Immortal Beloved, and there was a scene in which Beethoven walks by a group of musicians, and there's this black violinist. And I'm like, what? I've heard of colorblind casting, but this is a bit strange. And so I looked him up. And I didn't intend to write poems about it. I just wanted to know more about him. And I kept reading, and the more I read, the more I realized the only way I was going to get him out of my head was to get into his and start to write about him. So in each case, it's been something like that. I think it's going to be a mix of things. What I find very interesting, well, first of all, poetry of all the forms of literature, I think, is the most suited for the digital age and for the shorter attention spans and all of that. It twitters very easily, some lyric poems, and it's very easy to zip a poem to someone. So that's one of the things I think is wonderful about poetry in the digital age. I think that there's going to be a mix between people who will really only need to see a book on a page, and those who will only want to hear it on the stage or want to hear the oral word. What's interesting about the digital age is because of all of the ways in which we have of transporting moving images now and making it very portable, the oral aspect of poetry is coming back. And poetry began as an oral discipline. Then we had the printing press, and then it became gradually something which began to lose a little bit of its musicality because now we could read it. So all of the rhymed poems, which, all the formal poems, which certainly began as a way of helping us remember a poem as an aid to memory if it rhymed. That wasn't necessary anymore. We moved away from that. Now we have spoken word. Rhyme is coming back in. So it's absolutely fascinating to me. I think it's going to change a little bit more, become a little bit more musical, and we'll have a whole range of things. But it's an exciting time. My first advice would be to read, which sounds interesting coming in a digital age, but it's so much easier to listen to a poem than it is to sit down and actually read it and to hear it in your head. And that's something that every poet or aspiring poet needs to be able to do, I think, to hear it in their head. What I wish someone had told me, I wish someone had told me that my stories are really mine to tell. In other words, anything that I think is important or that has moved me has the ability to move somebody else. It was a long process for me, and I think for many young poets, to be able to realize that even the smallest, the most domestic experience can move someone else. It doesn't have to be about the Trojan War. You know, it doesn't have to be the Iliad. It doesn't. It doesn't have to be something that, again, here we get to history, that makes it to the front page of the news. But we live our lives in detail. All of us, we walk down the street, we breathe, we hear things. We try to transcribe it in generalities, and the details are what make us come alive. And I wish someone had said that just at the beginning so I wouldn't have felt so discouraged when I began writing and thinking, who would want to hear the stories of a young black girl, you know, growing up in the Midwest? You know, that's not interesting. I have to live in Paris. No, you don't. I'm not thinking of my audience, which does not mean that I'm doing it for myself. I'm thinking, at the very beginning, when I begin writing a poem, I try not to think of the audience or anyone at all, except for trying to get at the very center of what's driving that poem. Why, in a way, it's like analyzing myself. Why did I even sit down to write this? Why is it even interesting? What is it that drives this thing? That means that means going down into the very deepest psychological moments, things that can frighten and scare you. And I think that to think of an audience at that point would actually drive those thoughts away. And during the process of revision, what happens is that I'm thinking about the language and how I can use the language, which is my tool, to convey whatever this experience/emotion is, so that if anyone else sits down to read it, they can also feel it. So it's beyond just talking about, describing something. It's also using words which help to shape the emotion, so that if it's supposed to be something very hectic or a frantic moment, then the words probably would be shorter and clipped and, you know, things like that. And during that revision process, it becomes less and less a private matter and more something for an anonymous audience. I don't try to imagine an audience in the sense of, at that stage, I don't try to imagine an audience in the sense of, well, these are all educated people, you know, from the ages of 18 to 40, you know, 5. I just think of, there's someone out there who might want to read this. If they read this, I want to get them to feel the same thing that I'm feeling. And that's my audience. But that, in the end, I'm thinking only of them, and I'm not there anymore. It would be wonderful if we were striving toward a post-racial literature, and certainly the election of Obama is a big step on the way. I think that we shouldn't get complacent and think, oh gosh, now we're post-racial. We are not. We haven't had the conversations we need to have about race and privilege and all of that stuff. We're starting, so we're on our way. But one of the things that I've always dreamed of is to have a post-racial literature. You waste so much energy and good talent either trying to insist upon your presence, which is certainly what happened in the Black Arts movement in the 60s, for instance. And you also waste a lot of energy then, gee, I lost my thought. Let me think. Well, you waste a lot of energy insisting upon your presence, but then you also can waste a lot of energy explaining things which are specific to a certain racial culture, which, if you think about it in terms of the mainstream, we don't mind looking things up if we don't understand them, but we kind of expect to be clued in on various things that happen in the culture. One of the things that I've always found frustrating are the little reference points that I might have to explain in a poem that I wouldn't have to explain if it were if it were a mainstream detail. For instance, I know exactly how a white woman would do her hair every morning. I know the washing and the blow drying and all of that kind of stuff. But so that if I see that in a poem, if it were to occur in a poem, then I would have no problem with it. Whereas for me to even to get up and to explain getting up and rushing and how to do my hair, it would require all sorts of glosses. You know, I'd have to say, oh yes, there's the hair pomade and there's the this, and so my hope is that in a post-racial culture, all these kinds of details, we will just assume that we can figure them out, or we will assume that it's something as we read them that we'll have to look up, instead of demanding that our writers give us a gloss right in the middle of the poem. I think we're on our way. It's so funny. When I was Poet Laureate, when I was named Poet Laureate, I went down to Washington a little bit beforehand to meet the assistant, to meet the Librarian of Congress and all that, and to kind of acclimate myself. And I did ask what my duties were. The only official duties are to sponsor a reading series at the Library of Congress twice a month, and to make sure that so that was fun, to be able to invite poets from all over the world, actually, to come to read and to read for the archives. That was one official duty. The other duty was to advise the Librarian of Congress, and also, and this was a funny one, to promote poetry in any way that I see fit. I said, what does that mean, to promote poetry? And I said, well, what's the budget? Because if you're going to promote, you budget. And I got a kind of a blank stare. So I thought, okay, this means that you make it up as you go along. What else does, I'm an artist. I could create. And I decided to just do things and figure they would stop me if they didn't have enough money, which was probably a good way to go about it, because they did find money for various things. But what was interesting, it's sort of like being Miss America for poetry, and that as the Poet Laureate, you have an immediate cachet, and you have status. People see you. You have some kind of publicity, some kind of public stage. And I thought of myself as being more like a lightning rod. People would say, oh, there's a Poet Laureate, let's ask her, or let's tell her what to do. And I got so many letters right from the beginning from people all over this country telling me what I should do. And some of them were really good ideas. So, and I couldn't implement all of them in the time I was there, in the 2 years I was there. The one thing that I found very, very helpful was to remember that many people are very frightened of poetry, and as Poet Laureate I had a chance to travel around to just inject poetry into everyday life whenever I could. And so I visited grade school kids, or the Naval Academy, I mean all sorts of places where you thought, didn't know they liked poetry, or where poetry was absolutely necessary. So each Poet Laureate decides kind of how they want to use that public arena. And I decided to try to just be there in people's faces whenever they turned around, to make poetry something that was all around us. So I went on Sesame Street, for instance, and yeah, it was really fun. The other thing that happens with the Poet Laureateship is that when I was in Washington, there was an opportunity to inject poetry into the government. And though the Poet Laureate does not have to write official poems for anything. There were many occasions when I would be asked to say a few words, which is, of course, a kind of a euphemism for, do you have a poem? But there's always a poem. You can always find a poem for almost any human situation. So I didn't write poems for specific events, but I could look and see if I had a poem which would fit. And because I think that it's always important. It's important if there's a celebration for some bill being passed, it's nice to have a poem there to remind us all of the human element and the human effort that went behind it. So that was important too. The Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry is it's a gargantuan project, and basically I'm trying to make sense poetically of the 20th century in America. So it starts really right there with Edgar Arlington Robinson, and it goes up until anything published in the year 2000. I'm trying, so what the difference in this anthology is, and instead of just a poem here, a poem there, two poems by this person, I'm trying to give a sense of major poets who then influenced other poets as well, so that there may be quite a few poems by, say, let's choose someone, William Carlos Williams, and then show how he influenced all sorts of other poets who may have a few other, not as many poems in the anthology. What makes a classic poem? I think that when a poem can move readers across generations and across its specific class or race, then it becomes truly classic. I mean, in other words, if the poem is so moving that even if you have no experience in that particular setting, be it 1920s, Harlem, let's say, you still are so moved that you can put yourself in that position. That means that the writer has managed to go beyond the personal and touch the humanity in all of us. And it's really a blast to read it, because I realize how that this does hold true for the truly great poems. Oh gosh, no, there's not a specific poem. It changes depending on the what I'm working with, where I'm at the moment. But there are just poems that are just so amazing to me. And if I name one, then I of course lose another. But it goes in and out. I think that. Let me think. I can't name a specific one. Lines flow through my head. There's a very beautiful German poem by Goethe, which I often say to myself, because it's like a little prayer, but it's also totally untranslatable. I've never been able to translate it. And it's humbling, because you realize that we need translators. Please, 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 we need our translators. Otherwise, we'll never have any of these poems. We would never know how Baudelaire moves us or anything like that. But you also realize how much gets lost. How necessarily poetry is so bonded to the language in which it is composed that you're always going to lose something, and I find that very humbling. So, yeah. But it's a wonderful little poem, and it rhymes, but it rhymes in odd ways. Über alle Gipfel herrscht Ruhe. In alle Wipfeln spürest du kaum ein Hauch. Warte nur, balde Huas du auch. That's it. You can hear the rhymes. And basically translated, it says, over all the mountains, tranquility rests. In all of the tips of the trees, and that's Wipfel, which is a great little word, and all the tops of the trees, you can hardly feel a breath. Wait, just wait. Soon you too will rest. And it's because of the rhymes it makes, and it's such a calm poem, and and certain words are totally untranslatable, like Wipfeln, which does mean tips of the trees, but that doesn't sound very good in English. But it almost rocks you to sleep, and I just find it an incredibly amazing poem for its tightness and yet tranquility. Let me think. What could I do? A lot of them. I'll read one. I'll read a short one. Okay. But I have to give you a little gloss for it. If I can find it. All right. In this poem, this is from my new book, Sonata Mulatica, which tells the story of George Bridgetower, a mulatto violinist from the 18th and 19th centuries. In this poem, he was a prodigy. He was a little boy, 10 years old, in England, playing his violin in front of all of the music lovers of London. And his father is sent away from London. The Prince of Wales says, I'll take care of the little boy. And so you have this little boy who has the best job in the world for a musician, but at the same time has no family. And in this poem, the prince has ordered him to go into his room and to change into British clothing. The Undressing. First the sash, peacock blue, silk unfurling round and round until I'm the India ink dotting a cold British eye. Now I can bend to peel off my shoes, try to hook the tasseled tips into the emerald sails of my satin pantaloons. Farewell, Sir Monkey Jacket, monkey red. Adieu, shirt, tart and bright as the lemons the prince once let me touch. Goodbye, lakeside meadow, goodbye, hummingbird throat. No more games. I am to become a proper British gentleman, cuffed and buckled with breeches and a fine cravat. But how? My tossed bed glows, while I am a smudge, a quenched wick, a twig shrouded in snow.